so much that we could talk about. And Aaron, I'll start with you. I'm sure you've had 100 variations of the why did you do this? So let me ask you this version. There was some point where you could choose to spend your time any way you wanted to. And you chose to spend enough time with this man to gather 70, 80 hours of footage, as I understand it, dive deeply into his life and his commitments. Why was that the most compelling next thing for you to learn about and present as a journalist?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for appreciating so many parts of his personality that we had hoped to capture. And I just want to say a quick shout out to Jeff, who is the co-director and producer, is holding up a camera in the back, and editor. I mean, I can't not talk about the 2016 election in reference to what, for me, every time going back to this project made me feel like I was doing a little something to say something other than what I felt the national conversation around me was saying. So this isn't a great answer to that, except that I was really worried. I was freaked out, to be honest, and spending my time with Michael Dukakis and what I think he represents was some of the most reassuring moments of those subsequent years and the many years that we spent working on this.
Juan, what do you think he represents?
Hope, honestly. I think, first of all, Aaron and Jeff, awesome. Props to you guys, as always. I would say that right now, more than ever, Governor Dukakis really embodies good government and how it's still very much alive today, right? And everything going on nationally, everything that may be going on in our individual communities, we're living through such polarized times, but there's still hope. There's still a path forward for us to continue and have good people doing good work just to deliver services in our communities and keep this country moving forward.
So, Ian, good people and good work to deliver services. Mm-hmm. You do this massive podcast that takes a deep dive into the Big Dig. There are multiple hours of that where Michael Dukakis is a real life character in that story. Did you learn something about his approach to governance in doing that podcast that was new or different to you?
Yeah. The first thing I learned is that no matter what question you ask Michael Dukakis, the answer is the north-south railing. I swear, I would ask a question about, Tip O'Neill in 1984 and some subcommittee or an environment, and it would always come back to the north-south rail link, which, I think what it says about the governor is that he's very forward-focused. And I think what that project, what the Big Dig project really illustrates for me about Dukakis is there's this evolution in him and in Fred Salvucci, his transportation secretary, during the course of that project, where they came in, with this sense of idealism that, oh, it's a great project, everyone will believe in it, it'll be simple. And they moved it pretty far in that first administration, but then, of course, they got voted out of office in 1978. And they both talked about that as such a crucial moment. And in some ways, there's some parallels to, 1988.
Dukakis lost to Ed King, who was not prepared to carry forward.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think there's what the story of the Big Dig captures for me about Dukakis is this arc from idealism to also pragmatism and learning how to be coalitional and strategic. And that's ultimately, what made it possible to move the Big Dig forward, was not just that they had a wild vision for it, but that they had a real coalition behind it.
So now that we've heard from each of our panelists, I do want to invite you to be a part of the conversation. Here's how you can do that. You can see it right here on the screen. You can use your smartphone to submit a question. You go to slido.com and you input the keyword Dukakis. You can put your question there, and we will try to incorporate as many as we can into the conversation this evening. So I've watched this a couple of times, this documentary, in preparing for tonight, as well as reviewing some conversations I've had with the governor in the past, and sort of looking at the arc of our political history over the last 40 years. And one of the things that is striking about that is when you think of the arc of someone's career, you think of an arc. But there is this other kind of presence that Michael Dukakis has beyond his disrupted terms as governor, beyond his failed run for the presidency in 1988. There is this presence that runs through, that feels specific to him. And I wanted to kind of raise that. I thought I was going to go to Aaron first, but interestingly, Juan, you're really nodding. So you pick it up.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I would say, obviously his career as an elected official, but afterwards when he went on to become a professor and a mentor to so many. And, before the show, I saw a couple of folks, Trip Jones, Tom O'Brien, all Dukakis alumni. There's maybe many more in the room, folks who worked within his administration, who went on to do incredible things. You have Tom O'Brien, an incredible public servant who on the development side is building 10,000 units between East Boston and Revere. We need housing. We're at a crisis point. And here's a Dukakis alum and a great person all around. If you don't know Tom, you should get to know the guy. He's great. Trying to solve problems. The cavalry is not coming, right? Like, we are it. We are on the ground doing work day in and day out, whether in the private sector, in the public sector. And there's so many people who have been touched and influenced by Governor Dukakis, whether working for him, whether as a student, whether as a mentee. I personally am very fortunate to be one of those folks. And there's so many others like myself who can go on and carry on, right? Like, he will always have, we are the living memorial of Michael S. Dukakis, and we will carry out a lot of his values and a lot of the things he tried to instill in his students and everybody he came across. So I definitely agree with that.
I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes on the mentoring idea, but Aaron, I want to turn to you here. One of the things that we think about with former Boston Mayor Kevin White's administration, for example, is this idea that there were then alumni that came out of working for Kevin White that went on to sort of shape so much of the future of Boston and the future of the city and policy. When you spent time with Governor Dukakis, first, over how many years? 5 years?
7.
7. Over that 7 years, tell me how he communicated his own sense of legacy to you.
When Jeff and I met with him early on, he immediately talked about his students and immediately talked about wanting young people to really pick up the mantle and serve in government roles or in community capacities of various kinds. Yeah. So the legacy of instilling what Juan has said, hope, but also skills. One of his ways that he really liked to teach was through case studies. And so there would always be these examples, these big examples of successes and failures. And I think that he wanted students to learn both successes and failures, which is part of what I think he demonstrates with his own arc of sorts. And I think that he really just wanted them to go out and try and be involved and to do so at any level, because any and all levels of engagement are valuable, necessary for a healthy functioning democracy.
Let's stay on successes and failures for a couple of minutes. Ian, I'll come to you, as you chart the history of this massive transformation of really the face and the bowels of the city, right? Through the Big Dig. It really was a story of epic success and, dude, some epic financial failures and challenges as well. And I wonder, we often talk about the governor and, that you have in the podcast, the press conference where they announce, we're going to do this thing. Mm-hmm. And then there's literally a handful of days to deliver a book-sized proposal to the federal government. What is the epic success for Michael Dukakis in that picture? And what is the epic failure?
I mean, I think what's easy to forget about a project like the Big Dig is that it was really a 40-year project. It's like 1971, 72. The Boston Transportation Planning Review comes out and first floats it.
Actually, I'm sorry, I should pause you. Do I need to define the Big Dig for this audience?
This audience?
Okay. That's what I thought, but not doing my job if I don't check. So, all right, back to you, Ian.
I think these are our people. I think we're okay. I don't think we need to define Scheme Z in this crowd. I don't know. Maybe. I think what's easy to forget is it's a 40-year project. Like, I knew it as like a 1990s project as a kid, but it's really like a 1971 to 2007 project, right? And, the way these projects work is they're conceived under one administration, permitted, funded under a second, designed under a third, constructed, et cetera, et cetera. And so part of what, is so remarkable about Dukakis is serving 12, years in office spread over 16 years. He was able to shepherd this idea pretty much to the starting line, which is, even just getting to the starting line, from the drawing board to the starting line, is a huge achievement and very unusual for what's, a generational infrastructure project. It's funny, when you talk to, there's this kind of bifurcated narrative of the Big Dig. When you talk to Dukakis people, the general feeling is we had this great thing and then the Republicans kind of mucked it up. And when you talk to the Republicans, in the Weld administration and beyond, they're like, well, we got this thing that was a total mess and we did the best we could with it. And I think there's truth and selective truth in both narratives. But what I think is so important about what Dukakis and Salvucci and his administration did is they did whatever they had to do to get it to the point where it had to, nobody was going to say no to it at that point. And there's so many projects like this that could have happened. If you look at New York City, they had something called the Westway, I think it's called, to put the West Side Highway underground, reconnect, the western side of Manhattan with the river. The Big Dig is not the only project like this that could have happened, but it's the only one that did happen. And I think that is because of this really unique alignment of political will and political capital between a very popular, powerful, smart strategic governor, a powerful congressional delegation, all these stars aligned. And there's no way that happens without Governor Dukakis.
And that thing you're referring to is the West Side Highway.
Yeah.
In New York City, yeah. So I've got an audience question I'm going to ask in a minute, but before we do that, I said I wanted to talk about successes and failures, right? A term that had come up. Ian, I asked you one question. Aaron, I'll come back to you. When Michael Dukakis was running for president, Saturday Night Live did a skit. John Lovitz was playing Michael Dukakis. He's debating George H.W. Bush. And at one point, he basically turns to the camera and says, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy, right? It's a very famous political skit from Saturday Night Live. You touch, but it's a touch in this documentary. And I wonder about the choices to touch on it. And was that your choice to only touch? Was it his choice? Is that still a painful thing he doesn't want to talk about? Tell me more.
No, he certainly didn't have any say in any of those, any editing or story structure decisions at all, except for guiding us to kind of follow his teaching, and so then we started in that way. But we had so many conversations about this, so many conversations, and in fact, an earlier version of the film opens with him losing and conceding the race, and that was the opening clip because we wanted to say what we all know, which is that he lost this election. But for a lot of Americans, not in this room, we're fortunate. That is how he is known. It is as a loser, and with a very negative connotation at that. We really wrestled with whether or not we could come back from that in the same way that has his reputation actually come back from that outside of rooms like this that know better. So, all I can say is that we spent a lot of time making this film, and as that evolved, our thinking evolved too, and also the culture, the climate of what was happening outside and elections, et cetera, made us decide to have a lighter touch. So it was very much, that's where if Jeff wanted to, if you want to talk to Jeff after, you can.
Thank you.
I hope that helps, but certainly not. The other thing is that we both actually felt like the '88 election has actually been covered and dissected in a way that really talks about the loss, how it happened, why it happened, the Bush attack strategy, Lee Atwater's role in that, his later apology. We felt like that was ground that had been
Lee Atwater's
covered.
role, the Willie Horton ad.
Exactly.
So we get the reference.
Even, to be honest, we were very reluctant, even until very late in the production process, to even have the ad, to have a picture of the tank. Like we didn't. That's just not who he is to us. Yet we also understood the importance of context and story to understand, and that is with help from actually probably a few people in this room too, thinking through knowing someone's highs and lows is part of what makes them compelling.
So go ahead, and then I'll.
I was just going to say, I thought one of the moments in the film that really caught my eye was when he's in the high school, and there's this sort of like the students are kind of giving him this blank look, like they have no idea who this is, and then somebody's like, "Yeah, you ran against Bush," and it was like, "Oh, and there's like I can't remember what it is that cues it, but it's like this inescapable nature of being known. Having that is like the immediate point of reference, but then he's able to immediately move beyond that.
So, nothing ventured, nothing gained, Juan. And sometimes when you venture, you lose. And if you choose to venture in the public space, you lose in public. And that is part of the cloth you're then dressed in, right? I wonder, as somebody who mentored you, we are very clearly given sort of we know from the video, right? Markey campaign, then Driscoll and Healy campaign, and now you're deputy chief of staff. So we kind of know where you're going in terms of the political trajectory of your career.
Good thing I grew out my hair.
Well, you haven't lost yet, so.
Yeah, that's true.
How did his experiences season, temper, and or ignite for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say a couple of things. One, he always reminds me that, Juan, you need to grow up to be a progressive who knows how to count, and how important it is to just balance budgets to make sure you're doing good government and good governance. So that's one thing I would say to just a conversation about successes, and just operationalizing that, and as it relates to the big successful project that was the Big Dig. So I would say it's been very. I think you could almost say that history, of course, repeats itself, but you could go back and see the '88 election, or even Democrats throughout the '80s. I think it was the '84 election where Democrats lost, or the Democratic nominee lost every state except, or
It was like only 13 electoral votes.
Yeah, like literally won one state in the entire election for president. So I would say like how it relates, I think for me how it relates to today is that Democrats, we're kind of, we're at a point where we're trying to figure out what comes next for us as a party. And I almost want to say that, Governor Dukakis, I wasn't even born then at the time, but, I could feel a sense of that, those same conversations almost happening, where it's like, where does the party go now, right? And if I can critique lightly our party right now, because you praise in public but criticize privately, but the only comment I will make about Democrats today is that I think we've gotten away from being the party being the lunchbox Democrats, right? Supporting the person who works a 9 to 5, packs their lunch, right? Drives home in their Toyota Camry, or maybe takes the T. And we've become the party of Whole Food Democrats. And as someone who shops organic and goes to Whole Foods, we love Whole Foods. But that's to say that we need to get back to being the New Deal Democrats, like the Tip O'Neills of the world, the Mike Dukakis of the world, the folks who really cared about working class folks, making sure public transportation was reliable, and making sure that the pocketbook issues were a part of the main conversation that was at the table. So that's all to say that I feel like history repeats itself, and there's so much we can learn from, that I've learned from Dukakis, and that I just see now that we can learn from.
So I want to pick up a first audience question, and again, you can submit your questions at slido.com. You use Dukakis as your keyword, and you can bring them in there. It's a compound question. I'll ask the two together, and then it's open to any of the three of you, Ian, Juan, Aaron, who want it. Where do you think Michael Dukakis' passion for public service comes from, and does he have recipes to inspire that spirit in people today? Who wants that one?
That's a great question. I will say that, going to my earlier point, just like the living memorial that he's been able to build by those he's mentored and who have worked for him and day in and day out try and do good in whatever industry that they are. There's still hope for us to move forward from all the craziness we're seeing nationally. So yeah, that would be my.
Aaron.
Absolutely. You asking this group of people, like, how many of you have been impacted by his policies? How many of you have been sitting on the T or seen him on the T? Like that is, it's just so meaningful. It's so meaningful to feel like you really care about the person who's taking care of government, that there's an integrity to they're showing up every day, and that what they say is what they do, is what they say is what they do, that those are connected things, that they're not, that they walk the talk, and that they do it not just for themselves but for their neighbors. I just think it's incredible. I think it's incredibly hopeful to see him as an example of that, and someone who his entire life remained that way.
So, Ian, I want to reach back now and grab a thread from a few minutes ago in the conversation where you talked about, it was proposed a lot of places. It was only done here. The specificity and unusual nature of Massachusetts
Why
in
us?
that air.
Why here?
So, but I want to go a different place with it. So bear with me. Erin, you had provided us some outtakes that were not in the final product. And I'd like to bring up the outtake where Governor Dukakis talks about firearms. So if we can bring that up for just a minute.
Can we stay?
You'll be able to see it right here. Pardon me for pointing.
People used to say to me during and after the presidential campaign, were there any surprises? I would say to them, yeah. The one surprise to me was the gun culture outside of Massachusetts and southern New England. I'd never encountered this kind of thing, this passion for guns. Now, I shot 22s competitively as a kid. I was an expert rifleman in the Army. So it's not as if I'm unfamiliar with weapons. But for the life of me, I've never understood this affection for and passion for owning, using, controlling concealable handguns, whose only purpose has to be to kill somebody else. So I am a proponent of very tough gun controls. I'm very proud of the fact that Massachusetts has some of the toughest laws in the country. And as a consequence of that, we have the lowest homicide rate in America and the lowest suicide by gun rate in America.
So important stats, an important idea. Go ahead. One of the things that struck me when I saw that outtake was, so I've lived in Boston for 30 years, but I grew up in Michigan, and I grew up in a gun culture. Firearms in my house, I learned to shoot when I was 12, right? It's gun culture. So I happened to look it up, and other than one exception, the last time somebody who grew up in Massachusetts was president of the United States, other than John F. Kennedy, was in the 1820s. And I wonder if the same things that sometimes make Massachusetts builds consensus and allows us to do big things and great things together puts us out of touch with the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. Obviously, Massachusetts has sort of for a long time prided itself as a laboratory, as an innovator. We can see that in so many areas, in transportation and governance. I mean, the Massachusetts Constitution is in effect the model of the federal Constitution. But I think in some ways it sort of speaks to Juan's point about how the Democratic Party has shifted and become this more professionalized, highly educated, very sort of like, think tank oriented party. And I think you can see, that's not unique to Massachusetts. But I think a lot of those trends were very pronounced here. You think of going back to the Atari Democrats in the 80s and 90s. I think those trends, you can really see that here.
I actually don't know the phrase Atari Democrats.
The Atari sorry?
Neither do I.
That was very tech-oriented Democrats.
Okay, that
People
kind of
associated
Atari.
with Al
All right.
Gore.
Thank you.
But there were other folks earlier too. Yeah, Atari, the video game console. So just the point being, I think that some of those same trends that Juan identified as, challenging the party in national elections are very pronounced here and are worth taking a close look at. But it's hard to say. I don't want to believe that the things that make this state, willing to experiment and try things are also inevitably going to alienate us from the rest of the country.
Go ahead.
So what I would actually say is our uniqueness nationally is what gives us such a competitive edge. We have, the first public transportation system in the country, the first library, the first school, the first public beach, by the way, Revere Beach. We have so many firsts. We are an innovative place to be. We are the safest when it comes to gun safety and lowest homicide rates in the country. So that is to say that we are a leader. And so how do we take a step back and remember the issues that are so important to people and just lead and focus on the issues, focus on making life better for people. And just because we don't grow up with a gun culture, fill in whatever it is, doesn't mean we can't sympathize or empathize with people somewhere else in our country.
So let's take another audience question here. I see President Jimmy Carter, the late president, obviously, and Dukakis is cut from the similar cloth and representing the, quote, greatest generation. Do you see parallels in our current cohort of political leaders?
I
ahead,
can
Erin.
say that I crammed some Jimmy Carter documentaries yesterday because of that similar feeling. I don't know that I can answer about the current cohort, though. Do you either?
I'd be biased if I didn't give a shout out to my bosses, Governor Healy Driscoll, Maura Healy, and Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll. They're the best, but I'm biased.
So I'm going to bring now another piece of another outtake. So let's bring up the mental health outtake.
Depression is not going away. It's the second most common disease in America. Only heart disease is more frequent.
And people don't know where to go. And I have a group that started a year ago, I guess.
Longer than that.
Longer than that.
Yeah,
2 years. Yeah. And we meet every month here, about 10 to 15 of us who are either in the throes of depression and it's not being met, or they need advice from people who have gone through this.
Okay, so I'll begin with disclosure. My husband was Kitty Dukakis' treating physician, that's public knowledge, for a number of years. So I think it's probably something I was keyed in on anyway. But there are two reasons that outtake struck me, and we'll do them one at a time. First, it is hard for me to imagine telling the story of Michael Dukakis without telling the love of Michael and Kitty Dukakis. And she, for any number of reasons, is not heavily present in this documentary, but they are a story together. And that outtake was one of the few places that you see them together. Talk about that, Erin.
I mean, what can I say except that both of them, there is so much story and so much life that they've both let. I mean, she could have her own entire documentary too. It just was a matter of timing and things to some extent out of our hands by the time when we started filming that made this so. But there was a point when I was like, could we make the love story documentary? I mean, they're really.
And you feel you could have?
I mean, I don't know.
I don't mean practically
right,
speaking.
Right.
I mean love story speaking.
Right. It's why I love the scene of them walking the dog together it's a love story for the ages. And so, but that's not the film that we ended up making. But I do respect that direction of a story. So if someone else here would like to pick up on that.
Slido.com, if
Right.
you want to do that. So Ian, the other piece of this, and I'll turn to you because I'm aware that you were part of a team that did a podcast on depression. It does also strike me, I mean, we're talking about transportation as one of the big issues still relevant and facing the state, mental health. And mental health services and shortages and the sort of tsunami of mental health needs that have come, especially post-pandemic, are certainly a policy and human reality for our state as well. It is striking to see them be so open, and it always has been, open and straightforward about depression and about Kitty's mental health experiences.
Yeah, I won't claim special expertise on this subject, but it makes me think of, you're talking about the parallels between Carter and Dukakis, and one of them that comes to mind for me is a kind of like transparency and a sort of risky kind of like openness and trust that like, I'm going to put this out there. And I think of Carter in the Oval Office talking about, you know, the energy crisis and turning down your thermostat, and
The cardigan sweater speech.
the cardigan sweater speech. And there's a similar kind of trust that happens when a public official has an adult, open, potentially vulnerable conversation with the public. And obviously, I mean, for that time, when Kitty Dukakis was talking openly about depression, that was something that was incredibly taboo. The documentary you mentioned that I worked on was about the author William Styron, who also endured a long struggle with depression and wrote about it and talked about it openly. And I think it's easy to forget now, in an age where it's so much more common to talk about mental depression and being treated for mental illness, that it's so hard. It's easy to forget how radical that was for them at the time.
There's a lot more that we could talk about, but we're actually beginning to move towards the end of our time. I'm going to delightedly take a question from our audience and use it as a way to give you each a chance to maybe give us one more thing. So here's the question from the audience. As someone who has remained so himself, so consistently dedicated to certain issues, what is the most surprising thing about Governor Dukakis? Juan, I'm going to invite you to go first.
Gosh, that is a tough one. I would say, so I always like to remind Governor Dukakis that one day I hope and aspire to grow up to be half the man and half the public servant that he was. Because he truly is, transparent, honest, and just so down to earth that it's just so invaluable. So I don't know. I don't know that I can think of something that is. I think just how simplistic he has carried out his life day in and day out, especially after being at the top of national politics. And, just moving on after losing a presidential campaign, continuing to govern, leaving office, teaching, and just focused on, picking up trash in the streets. There was, and I'll be quick, I apologize. There was this event honoring Governor Dukakis not too long ago, and former Governor Deval Patrick was there. And, he was mentioning that when he was in office, of course, the governor would call about the north-south rail link, but he would just randomly also call when there would be trash, along Storrow Drive, and somebody needed to go and pick that up, and just like the small or I'd see him coming into the office with a plastic bag filled with like trash that he just picked along his walk. Just like the way he simply lived his life is so unique. Just to see the person and all that he lived and experienced throughout his career.
Ian, Aaron, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think when I first met him and then in watching the film, one of the things that surprised me is that he's very funny. When you think of like the Dukakis political brand or legacy, humor is not among the top traits. But in person, I remember when I first sat down with him, I asked him about, how did you start working with Fred Salvucci, his transportation secretary? And like, without missing a beat, he was just like, you put a Greek and Italian together and you never know what could happen. And it's just, he's really quick with those lines. And it's a delightful quality that comes across in like, it reminds me that he really was a great retail politician too, which is not something I ever had a chance to experience, but he's great.
I mean, I think for me, it would be like being so impatient and just so urgent about everything, and yet having the long view, having the long view on things like public transit and just being relentlessly committed to that. So to be on both tracks, to be so impatient that you got to get this done and we got to get it done right now, but yet just like could see a 40-year project through. So I think having both of those things happening at the same time is super cool.
So as we wrap here, and I'll turn it back over to Amy in just a minute, and we'll thank our panelists. Here is my suggestion to you. This is a room that came from a place of affection and nostalgia. So before you leave tonight, understanding that that's the spirit of the room, share one story with somebody else in the room. Either something that this documentary made you remember, or the one that you thought maybe you were going to see there and were hoping for. But take a moment before you walk out and share that one little story with someone else in the room. And on that note, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for tonight, and Aaron and Jeff for the film.
Thank you all for coming.